Good morning, you smugs, and welcome to Comics for Breakfast. I'm your host, Jason Big Corners Mink. Longtime viewers will be shaking in their concrete galoshes at the sight of this get-up. That's right, it's the return of the crime hat. And that means this episode is all about crime comics, see? So don't get wise and clam up. Plant yourself, button your lip, and pop those peepers, 'cause we're about to head into the seamy underbelly of vice, larceny, and lawlessness. And if you squeal, I'll blast you.
Breakfast!
We begin with this startling selection from Leading Magazine Corporation. It's All True Crime number 49 from 1952. That's right, and this baby is pre-code, so you know it's going to deliver the goods. But don't take my word for it. Pull down your slouch hat, pull up your suspenders, and let's go. In our first tale, Squeeze Play, Boss Dud Wickery is in charge of the town's numbers racket. And business is good. When it's not, he sends Hatchet Man Vic Logan to rain lead on the opposition's parade. Vic's brother Kirk is a whiz with numbers and keeps the books cooked for his hood bosses. That said, he's a pussycat, not a tiger, and shouldn't make much noise when Wickery's men rub out Brother Vic, who's fixing to take over the syndicate with his new partner, Fat Tom. Vic clues Kirk in on his scheme, but Kirk wisely wants no part of it. Later, the two brothers meet for dinner. Fat Tom has kept Vic waiting, but he gets news the man is just outside. Foolishly, Vic leaves the restaurant, only to win a one-way ticket to the boneyard. Kirk catches his brother's last words and vows to avenge the fallen man. Only instead of acting out, he plays it straight. Real cool Jonah. He goes to work for the mob as though nothing has happened, but when the time comes, he puts the screws to Wickery and the gang. Kirk has gathered enough dirt on these clowns to send them away for life, and if anything happens to him, 5 separate sources will send this information to the authorities. Kirk has taken over, see? He doesn't just want a slice, he's taken the whole pie, starting with Wickery's girlfriend. Kirk proceeds to play the gang for chumps, living it up on their dime while whining and dining their chippies. It seems like the perfect revenge, but Kirk didn't count on Batty, a thug who's just that. Batty takes exception to Kirk rubbing his rhubarb and shows it in the most bullety of ways. Kirk is killed by Batty, the gangsters are all run up the river, and the wheel of crime grinds relentlessly on. The prisoners concerns the Monty Bowers gang, a plane load of mobsters being extradited back to New York after a daring robbery. The robbers seem oddly confident, and justifiably so, as they've got a man on the inside. After a routine stop in Denver, one of the passengers pulls heat and commandeers the plane. The gangsters shoot up and prepare to bail out, but to make a point, they leave a bomb behind to blow up the plane. The gang dives out of the doomed plane, popping their chutes as the aircraft explodes. They come down in a rural area, landing on the farm of Ed Purdy, whose family rushes to the scene. The criminals give Purdy a line about what happened, and the sympathetic farmer takes the men in. Only instead of showing any shock or remorse after their escape, the men seem oddly content to just sort of hang out. Even stranger, the phone is no longer working. Before Purdy can get a line on the problem, he's given the skinny. Like it or not, the gang is holing up at his place until the heat's off. Just then, Junior shoots his mouth off about Brother Walt, who's the sheriff round these here parts. Why, if he gets wind of this, he'll give Bowers and his gang what for, by golly. And hey, here's Walt now. He's so good at his job, he's immediately disarmed and imprisoned in an upstairs bedroom. However, Walt isn't as useless as he first appears, escaping his confinement and then getting the drop on one of the cons. Now armed, but still outnumbered, Walt comes up with a plan to sow dissent among his captors. Criminals being the cowardly and superstitious lot that they are, the gang immediately begins fighting amongst themselves, the story ending, as these things usually do, with a murderous shootout. And hey, it turns out there was a reward on Bowers and his gang, a big 5 G's that goes towards saving the Purdy farm. If that ain't a happy ending, I don't know what is. The last story of this issue we're going to take a look at is King of the Cons. The year is 1941, and America's attention is on this whole World War II brouhaha. Few have noticed the seeds of destruction being sown at their very feet, as seen in this seemingly innocent newspaper ad. And while it appears to be a simple business opportunity, it is instead a greasy scam run by conman Ben Gabby Garson. He recruits a bunch of suited lowlifes and clues them in on his unlikely plan. He's going to sell common household items to dupes under the guise of emergency war supplies. The criminals are understandably skeptical, but to their amazement, Gabby's scheme works. Soon, folks are falling over themselves for items like common mop buckets full of anti-incendiary bomb sand and blackout fabric for the windows when we're inevitably pounded by the Krauts. But there's more. Those seeds are for victory gardens and recommended by the president himself. And hey, if you buy a helmet to go with them, you get to be an air warden. Say what you will, but I do not see a downside here. However, much like the time I bought those beans, the whole thing is just a bunch of hooey. One of Gabby's goons, Roy Craw, decides to cross up his boss. It's a bull move, but he gets chumped for his trouble. But this gives Gabby a new idea. He begins going door to door selling, and I kid you not, FBI memberships. At $25 a pop, it's an even better deal than that air warden thing. Gabby moves the gang to Texas, where they clean up on fake blackout candles, but the criminal has pushed his luck too far. He's abducted at gunpoint by 2 federal agents and driven out to the bayou, where he's shot in the back for his troubles. Just then, 2 state troopers appear, drawn by the sound of gunfire. They fire upon the men, and their car goes out of control, but one of the men survives. Turns out they're not G-men after all, but fellow criminals hired by Craw to rub out his boss. As a result of his arrest, the police have learned a great deal about gyp artists and how they operate. Study this handy eye chart so you don't get taken out. And that's the double head punch that is All True Crime number 49. Drafted in an era where it was far easier to tell the good guys from the bad, this issue is fun and uncomplicated stuff. While the critics might argue that this book glorifies crime, every story ends with the criminals being brought to justice. So it's really more exploitation than inspiring. If you read this book and decide that crime is a feasible career, well, that's hardly the publisher's problem now, is it? Sadly, this sort of personal accountability would be washed away in the advent of the establishment of the Comics Code, but for one brief shining moment the consumer could be trusted to make their own judgment when it came to such matters. While the criminals in these tales may indeed be shown living the high life, it's never more than lurid counterpoint to their inevitable comeuppance. For throwaway material, it's surprisingly virtuous and moral. We're going to gear up now for one of the most potent and effective crime stories to date. Only it's so much more than that. Written and illustrated by Jack Cole, Murder, Morphine, and Me first appeared in True Crime Comics number 2. Now, this tale has been discussed many times and is most often cited for its use of graphic imagery. Indeed, one of its panels was used by no less than Frederick Wortham himself to argue the dangers of comics on the young and feeble-minded. That's presumably us. However, Wortham obviously didn't read this thing, or if he did, he was too busy lathering himself up and missed the point. But enough of my balloon juice. Let's read the comic, as represented here in Mr. Monster's True Crime number 1. Our torrid tale begins with narrator Mary Kelly getting us up to speed, so to speak. Mary's been living the fast life of a dope dealer, but she's about to hit the skids. She wakes to a junkie in her bedroom demanding a hit, but the bum don't have no bread to cop, and she tells him to beat the street. However, the junkie's got another idea, and comes on strong, getting handsy. Bugged, Mary tells him where the dope is, and to take it and flake, but things have gone too far. What follows is eye-opening, to say the least, as Mary discovers just what it's like to be on the other side of the needle. She shrieks for Tony, but instead wakes her landlords, who are both concerned and hilariously Swedish. They rush to her bedroom, catching the deranged woman just before she leaps from her window. Miss Johnson does her best to soothe her addled house guest, which leads to Mary breaking down and starting our story off proper. It all began so innocently, and not so long ago, at Papa Donici's restaurant, where Mary worked as a waitress. The restaurant was located in the city's federal building and crawling with G-men. It was the last place you'd expect to find a gangster, but Tony Petrillo wasn't shook. Instead, he charmed the then innocent Mary into a date later that night, and the young woman nearly had a coronary as a result. Eat a salad, Mary. All of Papa Donici's food is clogging your arteries. Tony takes Mary to Nigo's Cafe, a sort of mobster Mos Eisley where the two get to know each other. However, their date is cut short when Tony sees a few guys he needs to punch, and punch them he does. Did Esther Gordon send them? He demands. No, Tony, they just came in for a drink. Mary realizes Tony really is the creep he claims to be, but she's smitten by... no idea. And isn't that always the way? Tony sweet-talks Mary into quitting her job at Papa Donici's and coming to work for him. And while Mary feels guilty about abandoning the man who'd been like a father to her, apparently money talks, and one Ben Franklin later, she's celebrating her new job by fornicating with a greasy criminal in the back seat of his car. And so what's this new dream job? Well, it's not as Tony's secretary, but instead as arm candy for the criminal's creepy compatriots. Mary's passed around like a doobie at a Country Joe in the Fish concert, but soon tires of this new role and all of these spinning heads. Whew. Mary seeks out Tony and, teary-eyed, tries to quit. Only, there's no quitting, see? Tony's up to his eyeballs in the dope racket, and now Mary is too. He's been using her to pass the stuff, and if she backs out now, the big boss will have them both rubbed out. However, Mary is a smart girl, and Tony can get her more money if she plays along. Meanwhile, outside, the two men Tony had previously assaulted at the Nigo lurk outside his door. Turns out they're members of Esther Gordon's mob after all. They're there to rub Tony out, but instead have a better idea, abducting Mary. They take her to Cordova Island, a lawless patch of sand in the Rio Grande between the U.S. and Mexico, where the gangsters are planning on taking over the local dope trade. They figure abducting Tony's girl and then letting folks know she's joined up with the other side will bring Tony running, and they can kill him there. They don't count on their plan going sideways and the competition killing the rest of their gang. Esther's car comes under fire and the gang takes off, but the vehicle wrecks as it speeds down the mountain road. Mary manages to get away from the slaughter and finds a room in a nearby town where she begins to recover. Unfortunately, Tony has tracked her down and works her over for betraying him. Mary pleads her innocence, and eventually Tony accepts her story. The two head back to town, but inadvertently stumble into the final brutal confrontation between Esther Gordon's mob and the island's gangsters. And let's take a moment to truly soak this panel in. Cole packs so much power and energy into this single image. There's a depth and sense of space, the dynamic figurework underscoring the masterful panel composition. Mary drags a wounded Tony off, but succumbs to her own injuries. Only instead of waking up at the pearly gates, she finds herself in another grimy dive. She's not dead, though, and that counts for something. And it turns out Mary's in luck. Someone known as the Professor has a new gig for her. She's going to be his secretary, managing the flow of drugs from Cordova to the U.S. And while she's not happy with it, Mary plays along. Eventually, she gets to go back home, where she's put up in a nice pad working as a front for the operation. It's there she learns of Papa Denici's son being killed in a seemingly motiveless drive-by. Mary goes to visit her former employer, who is now a shell of his former self. Mary leaves Denici to his heartbreak, returning to her life of crime. Only it's a short return, as a sudden and unexpected wave of arrests across the U.S. cripple the narcotics trade. When Tony gets wind of this, he decides Mary is too squeaky of a wheel to be left spinning, and heads off to grease her. But before he can, the Professor has Mary brought to him. And surprise, he's actually Jacobs of the Federal Narcotics Bureau, and she's in grave peril. To prove his point, Tony bursts in and shoots his one-time mole, but the G-men have his number and punch his ticket. It's then that we learn Jacobs here has been investigating the murder of Papa Denici's son, Joe. Only it wasn't a random killing. It was revenge, as Denici himself turns out to be the big boss. Shocked, Mary turns state evidence. Everyone still alive goes to jail, and the reader is left to decide for themselves if crime is really all it's cracked up to be. A story like this reminds you of just how direct comics could once be. There's no dancing around the subject here. There's nothing funny or hep about drug addiction, and Jack Cole does a remarkable job conveying a sense of anguish, need, and desperation that such a state would obviously create. There's an immediacy and directness here that belies a greater understanding of the subject than many educators hired on the subject would show. Cole knows where it's at and lays it on the line in terms that readers could not only understand, but relate to. And while this story has a reputation thanks to its graphic imagery, it should best be remembered as a warning from a creator already well-versed in the dark side of life. For our final book of the episode, we're going to jump forward into the grim and gritty 1970s. And who best to represent that most decadent of decades but Atlas Comics and Police Action? That's right, baby. Lomax is back, and he's brought Luke Malone with him. Now, viewers of Comics for Breakfast will be familiar with the Atlas Comics line, and we've actually covered Police Action 2 and 3 already. Why didn't we start with issue number 1? Well, that, my friends, is a rationale lost to time and departed brain cells, so let's not dwell on it. Midnight. A lone figure strolls from an elevator to a waiting automobile, which he enters, with explosive results. Smash cut to a short time later, and the area is now a crime scene. Enter Lomax, a hard-bitten cop who's seen it all. He's been called to the scene because he knew the murdered man, former Army explosives expert and cop, Sergeant Steve Brooks, but if there are answers, they'll need to be scraped off the wall. On a hunch, Lomax heads to the Club A-Go-Go, the site of Brooks' final investigation. He's surprised to see the dead man's girlfriend, Bobby, mixing it up with some grade-A crumb bums, and he approaches. The goons take issue with the nosy cop and try and muscle him, but hey, this is Lomax we're talking about here. He pulls this unlikely little maneuver, which isn't logical or pretty, but hey, he gets results. After driving off the flies, Lomax lays it on the line. He wants to meet with the club's boss, George Vincent. Vincent greets the visiting officer warmly, but Lomax isn't having it. He bulldozes Vincent, giving the club owner a good shakedown in an attempt to extract info on Brooks's killing, but Vincent don't know nothing, see? Lomax isn't convinced, but makes an empty threat anyway, then heads back to the station. It seems the bomb that blew Brooks's car up was massively overpowered, like using a bazooka to kill a fly. It doesn't add up, and he decides to lean on Bobby for answers. Lomax arrives to a scream. Kicking in the door, he's confronted by the reprobates he'd fussed with earlier in the club, who were in the process of roughing Bobby up. Lomax makes short work of them and calls for backup. He allows Bobby to go into the adjoining room, then listens in to her phone conversation. His suspicions about her are correct. She calls someone, fearful their plan has been discovered. Told to grab a few things and head straight to the airport, Bobby flees with Lomax in tow. So who is she meeting? Why, it's the dead man, Steve Brooks. Their double cross of Gangster Vincent has gone awry, but if they take off now, they can still get away. At least they could have, until that pesky Lomax tumbled their game. Our hero is dropped with a shot, but it only slows him down. Hey, if eating New York City hot dogs for 15 years hasn't killed him, what hope does a single bullet have? A gripping police chase follows. Honk, beep, crash! With the fleeing couple making it all the way to the airport. Only it's not going to be the clean getaway they thought. Vincent is waiting, and he doesn't like to be jerked around by anyone, see? He shoots Steve, but before he can kill Mary, Lomax makes the scene and ends Vincent. We learn Mary conned one of the club's bouncers into starting Steve's booby-trapped car, an admission that should see her going away for a long time. Nothing to do now but bury the bodies. Potent stuff. The second half of the issue is dedicated to Luke Malone, Manhunter, starring in Requiem for a Champ, written and illustrated by Mike Ploog. And who is this Luke Malone? A one-time cop turned private dick working out of Paddy's Pub, Malone takes the cases nobody else will touch. And hey, he's touching one right now. Murder in the Bowery. A Rummy's been gunned down with extreme prejudice. But why? Who would send in a professional to rub out a drunk? The police are clueless, but Malone has a few ideas. Known as the Champ, the murdered man was a neighborhood fixture, but the P.I. can think of no one who'd want him killed. Malone decides to break the news personally to the Champ's one-time girlfriend, ex-burlesque queen Annie, but instead finds her apartment being ransacked by shady thugs. And though he's no slouch in a scrap, it's 2-on-1, and Malone is knocked out with a chair leg to the head. Later, the P.I. revives and breaks the news to Annie, although, for some reason, she's now called Molly. We learn from the old woman that the murdered man actually was lightweight champ of 1940, and she shows this jeweled ring to prove it, but knows nothing more. Malone drops in on gym owner Goldie and begins asking questions. We learn that the champ was boxer Randy McNally. Randy was in deep with the mob and had been paid to throw a fight, but the pug had other ideas. With the fix in, the odds lay 10-1 against him, but McNally's wife, alongside his manager, Rufino, bet 100 G's on the champ, knowing that he wasn't going to take the dive. Their gamble seemingly paying off, the two attempt to leave town, but in the process, their boat mysteriously explodes. Trying to piece together this new information, Malone realizes he's being followed. He overcomes the thug and discovers he's a deckhand on the ship Brazilian Queen. However, the ship won't return to port for hours, so Malone waits it out at the Savoy. There he encounters known narcotics dealer Bo Lester. Malone blunders his way into the middle of a deal and buys another whack in the noggin for his trouble. Man, this guy endures a lot of head trauma. The gangsters take him down to the docks to rub him out, but With that hard head of his, Malone proves surprisingly difficult to kill. He escapes his would-be murderers and heads for the Brazilian Queen. A clue catches Malone's eye, and he calls his old nemesis, Police Chief Brody, to the scene. When the chief arrives, Malone presents the little champ's murderer, the boxer's one-time manager, Rufino, hiding in plain sight as the chauffeur. It turns out Rufino didn't die all those years ago after all, but instead simply went underground, and it was his own lightweight championship ring which gave the criminal away, as both managers and the winning boxer get one. Undone by his own hubris, Rufino is fingered for the murder of the champ, and Malone returns to Molly's to let her know the case has been resolved. Molly is grateful, hanger-on Jill is horny, but Malone, understandably, has a headache. Ah, that Luke Malone, huh? What a tease. Luke would continue to play hard to get for 2 more issues, but the abrupt canceling of the Atlas line left the consummation of these 2 unresolved. Well, unless you want to read my fanfic of Police Action number 4. So what's the takeaway here? Crime has been a vital genre in the comics medium from its inception all the way up until today. Some of the most popular comics of the last few years have been crime-based, with a return to that pre-code grit and potency. And while many of these books lack the charm and energy which those old crime comics of the past possessed, they show that no matter what, we remain fascinated by those shadowy figures lurking just on the outside of the law. The world of junkies, thieves, and double-crossers appeals because, unlike a superhero comic, these are real things that we may encounter in our own lives, maybe even in the bathroom mirror. Thank you for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the channel. We're currently hovering in the 550s now, and I would love to hit 1,000 subs by the end of the year. If you can, click that little button that says so much. We thank you. For the Old Guys Who Like Old Comics Network, I'm Jason Mink, and I hope to see you next week at breakfast.